kanoti molongi bosi pen mawoti utakisende mulima mwamtete somonga pe matabambo utakisende mulima mwamtete somonga pe matabambo nula suita de kanoti molongi bosi pen mawoti utakisende mulima mwamtete somonga pe matabambo.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session on preventing harmful outcomes for children, an update on the prevention initiative. So first we are going to have, so the goal for this session is to bring everyone up to speed on where we are with the prevention initiative that has been a priority of the Alliance since 2018. And has gone through many changes over the past year. So a little over a year ago, we were able to release the primary prevention framework, and we're now onto this next phase. And so we would like to bring you all with us on this journey and see where we are. And I will pass it over to Kiara, who is the primary prevention focal point with the Alliance, to share a bit on where we are today. Kiara, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. We wanted to take the opportunity to start this session by sharing some updates of where the Alliance got on primary prevention since 2018. In fact, it was back in 2018 when the Alliance started putting an increased emphasis on primary prevention, acknowledging that in humanitarian crisis, most of the focus in child protection is on response after the harm has already occurred. It was in 2018 strategy consultations that prevention emerged as a key area of interest for child protection practitioners. This was also reflected in other sectoral developments, such as the development of the Inspire package or the review of the protection policy. While using different terminology, they all bring a focus to the holistic view of the child and preventing harm. An extensive desk review took place to understand what evidence was available in humanitarian settings on primary prevention approaches that work. The desk review found that this evidence was limited, but what we do have shows that we should be working across sectors and across the socio-ecological model so to prevent harm. The desk review informed the development of the primary prevention framework, which contains the guiding principles for effective prevention programming, and also provide a frame on how to promote prevention across the project cycle, from preparedness to assessment till evaluation and learning. It was in 2021 when this same meeting, the annual meeting of the Alliance, gave a wide space to talk about prevention. And we are now in 2023, where we are now applying, piloting the primary prevention framework in 2 humanitarian settings, and we are learning from its application, so to inform further developments in the area. This is possible currently thanks to funding from USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. But just trying to refresh memory, like what is prevention? And the image on the screen, I think it describes it quite well, as it does the quote you see on the screen that we borrow from Reverend Desmond Tutu. Like, we need to stop pulling people out of the river, we need to go upstream and find out why people are falling in. How does this apply to child protection in humanitarian action? So we are going to watch a short video that tries to answer these questions. So I would ask the producer if they can start the video. Thanks.
During humanitarian crises, such as armed conflict, natural disasters, and other crises, children are often the first victims and pay the highest price. The Primary Prevention Framework outlines 3 levels of prevention that can be implemented to prevent harm to children before it occurs. And in this video, we will briefly look at what these are. Primary prevention addresses the root causes among the population to reduce the likelihood of harmful outcomes. The target group is all children in a community or population rather than individuals. In primary prevention, sometimes a subgroup of children can be targeted as well. An example of this would be NGOs running family strengthening sessions for all families in a refugee camp. These sessions support positive interactions among family members and help to raise awareness around child maltreatment and healthy child development. Secondary prevention addresses a specific threat and/or vulnerabilities of children identified as being at high risk of harm. Rather than targeting all children in a population or subpopulation, secondary prevention identifies children and families at high risk of harmful outcomes and addresses the root cause of harm for those specific children. An example of this would be local organisations identifying an adolescent girl with a form of disability in a single-headed household as potentially at risk of sexual violence or exploitation, and referring her to life skills sessions for adolescents at risk of harm. Tertiary prevention targets individual children who have experienced harm and aims to reduce the longer-term impact of harm and reduce the chances of recurring harm. An example of tertiary prevention would be local organisations in a refugee camp identifying and then assisting a displaced child who is separated from family and is being cared for by an elderly woman. This assistance could include the child receiving case management support, including psychosocial support and referral to other necessary services, the adult receiving livelihood support, and the care arrangement being formalised as appropriate to the situation of the separated child and the adult. To find out more about prevention within child protection in humanitarian action, please visit the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action website.
Thank you. So you have seen prevention as to take action to stop the root causes of harm to children by identifying and addressing the risk factors that increase vulnerability to children to harm, and also strengthen those protective factors that protect from harm. But how to do it? Can we go to the previous slide, Natalie? But how to do it in practice. So you'll see a link in the chat soon where you will find a Menti and a question with you'll be given some key steps of prevention programming, and we would like to ask you to put them in order from the first to the last in the order you would do them in your program. So now if you join this link, you should find different steps of prevention programming Please just try to put them in order from the first to the last as you would do them in your program, and we can see the order coming up on the screen. So we'll wait a few seconds for answers to come in. Fantastic. Yeah, that is great, and thank you for engaging with us in this presentation. And actually, Natalie, now we can go back to the PowerPoint presentation, to slide number 3. So we can see how they count them in the right order. And here they are. Just let me take control of the slides. Yeah. So you see, identify harmful outcomes, and after that, go beyond the harmful outcome and identify the risk and protective factors in consultation with the communities. Rank them, and then analyze risk and protective factors based on the impact that they have on reducing a harmful outcome, and then on the feasibility. So how realistic is that we can address those factors in our programs, considering resources, capacities, finances, partnerships we have available to address them. And finally, develop a theory of change and prevention strategy. These are key steps that through the project cycle would specifically apply during your needs assessment and design and planning. In the primary prevention framework, you can also find key actions and examples of how to promote prevention in each phase of the project cycle. These are also steps that our colleagues from Plan International will speak in the panel later in this session, have gone through in the last few months, and we will have the chance to hear about their experience later. Now, we also wanted to say that the Alliance has developed several pieces of guidance and tools that can support the needs assessment, the design and planning of prevention programming. And we wanted to put the spotlight on them. When it comes to needs assessment in particular, you will find in the prevention framework a list of common risk and protective factors across the different levels of the socio-ecological model, from individual to family, community, society, international, regional level. And you will also find a specific guidance on identifying and ranking risk and protective factors using participatory approaches that engage communities in identifying risk and protective factors across multiple levels of the socio-ecological framework, and important to say also that are relevant in the specific context. Looking at the following step, design and planning, in the prevention framework, you will find a tool that aims at analyze and prioritize risk and protective factors by impact and feasibility. And also an example of a logical framework, as well as a list of evidence-based child protection prevention approaches that are designed at a population level that address different risk and protective factors and that span across multiple levels of the socio-ecological framework. You can also find some mathematical guidance that give some good examples of and guidance on how to prevent, for instance, family separation, or in the CAFAG Program Development Toolkit, you'll find a chapter on prevention strategies to prevent recruitment of children in armed forces and armed groups. And you can find the prevention reflections in the Interagency Toolkit on to prevent and respond to child labor. You will find the links to all these resources now in the chat. Finally, if you want to share awareness on primary prevention, please refer to the video series you can find on the Alliance website. We watched one of the videos earlier in this presentation on what is prevention. You can also find the second video on the importance of primary prevention. And if you want to improve the understanding of or strengthen the capacity of your team on primary prevention, you will also find 2 learning packages at this scope. One which is an introduction, a one-day training on the prevention framework, and the second one which is a more in-depth training curriculum for applying the primary prevention framework through the project cycle. If you would like assistance to navigate through the resources or on primary prevention, don't hesitate to reach out to the prevention initiative, and you can find the email address actually right now in the chat. And at this point, I would hand over the floor back to you, Michelle. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chiara, for that presentation and for bringing us up to date on where we are. So as Chiara mentioned, Plan International, with funding from the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, is currently piloting the primary prevention framework in 2 contexts, so in Niger and in South Sudan. And so we've had teams working in both countries to design and pilot a prevention project. So we have invited 3 panelists who have been supporting this effort to speak to the process so far. So joining us today, we have Paola, who is a child protection specialist with Plan, Hawa, who is also a child protection specialist with Plan, and Marion, who is a child protection specialist with Plan based in South Sudan. So thank you to the 3 of you wonderful ladies for joining us today and for sharing some of your experience thus far in piloting the prevention framework. As you all know, this has been a really incredible endeavor and full of rich learnings. So I think, and just so the audience knows, we have some initial questions that we prepared for them, but then we will be taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions at all on primary prevention, the prevention initiative, or more specifically, these pilots in Niger and South Sudan, please feel free to pop your question in the chat, and we will do the best to respond to as many as possible at the end of this session. But for now, I would like to ask you, Marion, who is based in South Sudan with Plan, why you were interested in being involved in piloting the primary prevention framework.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle. We were actually interested on the primary prevention framework because, as we know, South Sudan is a protracted emergency crisis. And most of the programs, not only for Plan International, but all other organizations, focus more on the response. So we were really keen to be able to have this shift. The other reason is across all sectors, in child protection, in WASH, food security, funding is really going down, and we have seen this trend for the past 2 years. So it's important for us to invest on primary prevention to be able to address the root causes, as Chiara has highlighted. And the other reason is there was a criteria that was set up by the Alliance Committee, and we met this criteria when we applied. They went through that and we qualified. Some of this includes looking at existing multi-sectoral programs within the target locations, looking at child protection and M&E capacity, to be able to deliver this, and willingness to implement the piloting project. So really we met this, and an additional one was willingness to participate in information sharing, our experiences, including participating in webinars the same way we are looking at today. The last contribution I would like to make is for South Sudan, we focused on 2 harmful outcomes, which is child labor and child marriage. So many organizations, not only child protection, but other sectors, we really benefit from our experience sharing today and in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marian. And yes, it was so clear when we were going through the process of selecting the potential pilot countries, how eager and excited the team in South Sudan were. And I know that it goes beyond just the plan team, and I know that there's been a lot of support from the CPHA as well. So that is all greatly appreciated. So thus far, we have gone through, as Chiara mentioned, this the prevention framework is structured according to the program management cycle. And thus far, we have gone through the preparedness, needs assessment, and most of the design and planning phases of the program management cycle. So Paola and Hawa, looking back at going through these 3 phases, what would you say were some of the greatest challenges during those phases? And and as a result, what were your most important lessons learned from those stages? I'll hand it over to you, Paola, first.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle, for the question. So actually, the objective of the primary prevention framework, as Chiara explained to us before, is to work on the root causes of harmful outcome in society. However, it can be difficult to change, to measure the evolution of harmful outcome in such a short time, mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, considering that some harmful outcomes are part of a deeply rooted and long-standing traditions. And secondly, as prevention can also be rather difficult to measure, as it is the absence of something occurring. So we spent a considerable time discussing the different levels of measurement.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Hey, how's it going?
I will continue. There is someone speaking behind. Okay, yeah, sorry. So actually what I was saying, so we spent a considerable time discussing the different levels of measurement we wanted to reach, as well as what we specifically were hoping to measure. And relying on a response mind frame is ingrained in most of us in the sector. And it is not uncommon for us to revert to utilizing the standard indicator in existence, that we rarely pause to question the system in place or ask ourselves, what are we actually trying to measure? What is the change we want to achieve? And how do we actually demonstrate that? Another difficulty we faced was about linking the activity level outcomes to the broader picture of prevention, going through the logical step of how a back-to-school enrollment campaign has proven to successfully prevent child marriages before they can occur. Actually, this was what we had to keep coming back to and keep challenging ourselves to think differently about. And regarding the lesson learned, as per definition of the primary prevention, we need to address the root causes among the population to reduce the likelihood of harmful outcomes targeting all children in a community or in a population. So working on this project, however, I have learned that dealing with a subpopulation can still be a primary preventive approach. When we say we need to work at population level, we might think that everyone in that area needs to be a beneficiary. However, in Niger, particularly in Diffa, through an intersectional analysis, we were able to identify specific characteristics, such as legal status, age group, gender, disability, and that helped us to prioritize the subpopulation more vulnerable to child marriage. It was one of our harmful outcomes. For example, we learned that girls aged 9-10 are most at risk to get engaged. Therefore, a subpopulation can be all female children aged 9-10 in a specific community or in a refugee camp. As such, when we designed the project aiming to prevent child marriage in DIFA through ensuring access to education, we did not plan to target all children, but only the aforementioned subpopulation that was at higher risk of child marriage. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Paola. And that is definitely a challenge that I think a lot of us have had over the course of the prevention initiative, is taking it from like that idea of a population level approach and what does that mean, and breaking that into manageable pieces. So really interesting to hear about how you achieved that in Niger. I'm going to hand it over to Hawa. I would love to hear about some of your challenges and lessons learned in South Sudan.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much, everyone. So continues to what Paola mentioned about Niger. So I'm here to share our experience in South Sudan. As Marion mentioned, in South Sudan, we was working in two harmful outcomes, which is child labor and child marriage. So throughout the process, we went through some challenge, but the main challenge was shifting our mindset from response to primary prevention or to prevention approach. As Chiara mentioned in her presentation, so prevention, which is like a very important thing, so it was like challenging for us just to shift from thinking or response in order to start thinking in the prevention. While initial training had been done in primary prevention framework, but still there was like there is still represented a huge shift in the mindset of the team. It's require us like a lot of discussion around the 3 levels of prevention, as Chiara mentioned. So for the prevention, there is like a 3 levels, which is primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. So we took like a discussion for the team in order just to understand how to differentiate between the 3 levels. In addition to that, even for the team to understand the primary prevention, it goes beyond the social behavior change campaign. And even for them, just to understand, when we're talking about primary prevention, we doesn't mean just being focused on the awareness raising activities or awareness raising program. As well as for them, just to understand, for the primary prevention, we are not just targeting all the population, as also Paola mentioned and how she explained that. The biggest change was learning how to use the primary prevention side of our brains, as I mentioned. So shifting from response to prevention, which is, it's took like a lot of time from the team, and even how they can just using the side of the prevention in their brain, as well as how we can just pull from our experience in response and just how we can just reframe that, and even how we can work on it in order to be like an primary prevention approach. So we had to consult, we had like a consultancy questions with the team in order just to make sure that they have like a full understanding of the primary prevention, and even now they're starting shifting from response to prevention. So I can say this is like new things for us, and even this is like new muscle in our brain. So we need like more exercise in order just to be shifting from response to prevention. So this is was like the main challenge that we faced during the implementation in South Sudan. So in addition to the lesson learned, honestly, we learned a lot from this piloting program, and even it adds a lot of things for us and even for the child protection or our team. So the main lesson learned for us, which is the community engagement approach that we use in the primary prevention. So usually as a child protection practitioners, we're using like the community engagement. But the approach that we use during the primary prevention piloting program, I can say that was like kind of very unique. And even the way that the community members, they've been engaged from the beginning, which is from the situation analysis until we reached like the design of activity, it was like kind of very unique. And even the community members, they play like a vital role in defining and ranking the risk and protective factors. So as Chiara mentioned, so the defining the risk and protective factor, which is one of the steps that we followed, and even this is one of the steps that we should use during the program cycle. The community member, they play like a very unique role, and even the engagement of them in this stage, which is gives them like the sense of the ownership. So the community member, they were feeling that, so when they identifying all the risk and the protective factors, as well going through the like the ranking of the top 6 risk and protective factors, so they commit themselves in order. So they will be like very active in order to stop the risk of the child marriage, as well the child labor in South Sudan, specifically in Yei community. So which is it's like an the very good lesson that I learned from this piloting program. And even when we been like so we have to think out the box in a way that we are just engaging the community member in order just to get like their ownership and even the sense of the accountability. So now I can say when we reach like the designing stage, so the accountability that the community put for themselves, it's like a very, very, very unique. So thank you so much. Over to you, Misha.
Thank you so much, Hawa. I really appreciate those perspectives from South Sudan, and agree that, you know, the involvement that we had from communities was really key to, you know, ensure that, you know, one of the things that we found is that with a primary prevention approach, it needs to be so contextually specific. And without having that engagement, we won't be able to properly tailor our intervention to what the actual drivers, the risk, and the protective factors are. So speaking of that, Marian, we are now, you know, nearing the completion of the design phase in South Sudan. We have our, you know, the outline of our activities. We are developing the M&E plan. Everything is moving along. Can you tell me about the activities that we'll be implementing and how we went about selecting those activities?
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. In relation to the two harmful outcomes, which is child marriage and child labor, there are several activities that we have designed. Part of this include advocacy on the importance of economic and livelihood support for parents and caregivers in Yei to be able to support children. There is also joint community mapping of economic and livelihood opportunities in communities, just going beyond the livelihood opportunities provided by the organizations, but also looking at opportunities within communities. The other one is about positive parenting sessions for parents and caregivers, including adapting the sessions to be able to highlight the negative impacts of child labor and child marriage. So not routinely the way we do positive parenting, but ensuring that it's adapted to benefit the whole community, the communities in Yei. We also agreed with the community members, including children, there is need to have a shift on school environment. So we will be implementing activity on supporting schools to adapt interactive teaching methods and participatory activities. This is to help us increase the learners' interest and attendance, because children said, you know, the school environment is not very interactive. So we will be working with schools in Yei to be able to adapt this. And also this will increase the engagement and support of learners in co-curriculum activities, which is part of the strategy also to retain children in school so that they don't go into child labor, which is a common issue that is in Yei. And then the other is to develop co-curriculum activity plan jointly with the learners to encourage regular attendance. So the learners told us we want beyond just football and volleyball, we want to do some puppetry. We want to do, some activities with peers, like using skits, role plays. So we will be working with this to make those activities more interactive, going beyond what is currently done. The other part is we are also going to train school management committees, parent teachers association, and school management, all those structures that are working within the school setup to be able to support and conduct community mobilization campaigns in order to increase the school enrollment, especially as many children face the risk of child labor. So we will be working with them so that they take that lead role in campaigning in their communities to support attendance. Due to high literacy rate in the location where we are implementing this pilot, they told us we don't have access to information, but there are community radio. So we will be also buying community radios, which will be stationed in strategic locations within communities to support mass information sharing on the 2 harmful outcomes that we'll be working with. I know you asked me how are they selected, as my colleagues have already highlighted, and also as Kiara presented. These activities were actually selected through community engagement. So we engaged community, as Hawa has highlighted. They told us these are the activities to prioritize. So we went through a thorough process where we had to do prioritization because they were actually a big list on what could be done and filtering what can go into primary prevention, what can we do now, but also what can we do in other sectors. We also went through a ranking and prioritization exercise. It was not easy, as How has highlighted, using one of the tools highlighted by Kiara. And then we went also back to the community with feedback, through feedback sessions. We were able to say, okay, these are the activities you prioritize. Which one can we be able to go with in the first phase? So through community feedback sessions, we were also able to prioritize this activity. And one of the unique steps that we also involved in is interpretation workshop, which we rarely do. So we did interpretation workshop with staff, volunteers, stakeholders, including government and authorities. And we all agreed that these are the activities to be able to address the root causes. So basically that is what we went through. And as Kiara had also projected, there is an impact and feasibility prioritization tool. This is very unique because the question is, how do we go through the process of designing? So we are moving child protection to more scientific model. So thank you, Michelle. And those are the activities and part of the processes that we have gone through, and we are already learning a lot and we are happy to share. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Marian. And what I find really interesting is listening to the activities in South Sudan. I mean, some of the participants might be thinking, those sound an awful lot like response activities, like inclusive quality education. Isn't that a key part of response? But the idea here is also thinking about this can also be prevention. Like what was really interesting was working through the idea of, with child marriage or with child labor, part of the problem is that, schools do not feel like a safe, inclusive space to learn. So if we want to retain students in school, if we want to improve retention and attendance of schools, it can't, we also have to improve the quality of the school. So yes, it's a response, but it also is a prevention measure. Because it's a way to keep children in school and prevent the risk of child labor before it can occur. It's also interesting how we've paired this then with working with caregivers specifically and looking at and saying, well, another risk factor here is a lack of access to basic needs, basic services, inability to cover basic costs within the family. So, we can make the school as inclusive and as quality as we want, but if parents still don't have opportunities for livelihoods, that's not going to change it. So really looking at this integrated multi-sectoral approach that uses a lot of response modalities, but actually reframing them, rethinking them in a prevention lens, which I think was also a little challenging to kind of wrap our minds around at times. My last question is for all of you, and I'd like to maybe say, since being mindful of time and wanting to make sure we have enough time for questions from participants, the last question is around what advice you would give to participants in this meeting who are looking to roll out the primary prevention framework within their organizations and contexts. And so I'd love to hear from each of you, maybe like your key piece of advice or the one thing you wish you'd known before you embarked on this journey. And Paula, I'll go to you first.
Thank you so much. So I would recommend that participants report on actual risk and protective factor instead of what could potentially or theoretically be risk or protective factors. Let me give you an example. Access to basic needs was frequently mentioned as a risk factor by whom referring to the actual lack of basic needs. And at the same time, it was indicating as a protective factor by those who referred to the potential enhancement of access to basic needs. So for this reason, we suggest highlighting the difference between actual and potential in order not to bias the result of the analysis. So this is like our advice from our experience in Niger. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I remember looking through the analysis and seeing, education or basic needs pop up as both a risk and a protective factor. And so saying, I can't tell which one it actually is. So that was a really interesting learning to have, even if it was a bit challenging to navigate at the time. Marian, can you tell us what was one piece of advice you would give to anyone wanting to roll out the primary prevention framework?
Thank you very much, Michelle. My advice would be that it's very important to have adequate preparation and consultation with stakeholders. As Michelle you had mentioned, we had a lot of support from Child Protection Area of Responsibility, from government authorities, and also stakeholders working in Greater Yei, including UN OCHA. So it's important to have that adequate time for preparation. The other is we saw it's very important to have child protection and M&E focal persons or technical person, because we struggled a bit for others to understand about what do we mean by harmful outcome, what do we mean by risk factors and protective factors. So having them to support it's really important. And as we have seen, it's not only for child protection, but other sectors, child labor, child marriage is an issue that is cross-cutting. The other one is it's important to explore strategies to integrate the other risk and protective factors that are not prioritized, that are not top 5 or 6. It's important to see how can other sectors, for example, education, how can FSL programs be able to take and integrate within this other, which we have done in South Sudan. And then lastly, it's important to actually advocate on the investing on primary prevention so that people can be able to see that once we invest in primary prevention, we can be able to address root causes and prevent harm before it occurs, which is actually more cost effective. So we have to do this both internally and externally. So for South Sudan, we are happy that we have had big support from the Child Protection Area of Responsibility and the stakeholders working in Yei, which is really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marian. And Hawa, what would be your one piece of advice?
Thank you so much, Michelle. Indeed, I have a lot, but I will share some of them here, or one piece. So for me, I would highly recommend for all of you just to take like a proper time to collect and synthesize the information in order to be able to develop a coherent program. In South Sudan, when we had all the data in our hand, which is the data that we collected during the focus group discussion, and even the data that we collected during the key informative discussion with the government and even with the UN agencies and with the other organization. So we took like kind of time. We took time just to look at how we can bring all this information together in order to be having like a coherent program. And also it will be good to have like an adequate time to train the facilitator, on primary prevention approach, because they will be like the main people that they will be collecting the information from the community member during the data collection process. And it will be good for them to differentiate even between the 3 levels of prevention, because during the ranking process, so even they will be having time just to identify the top 6 or the top 5 risk and protective factors. And also, it will be good for us or for you also to manage the community expectation. Because during the ranking process, the communities, they will be sharing all the risk and the protective factor that they have in their community. But in the end, we will ask them just to rank like the top 6 risk factors and the protective factors. So for them, it will be like, no, we need all the risk and protective factors that we share to be appear during the, when you're developing the theory of change or when you're developing the activities. So for that, it will be good from the beginning just to know how you can manage the community expectation. As we mentioned in the beginning, this piloting or this primary prevention, which is usually built on the community engagement. So for that, we have to know how we can manage the community expectation from the beginning. Thank you so much, and over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Hawa. Your advice around time really sits well with me, because that, I think, was one of my key learnings and my key piece of advice as well, is that because a primary prevention approach is so new to all of us, don't underestimate the amount of time that you'll need in terms of training, capacity strengthening around these resources, around the concept of primary prevention. Investing time in building up that capacity is really important, but then also ensuring that you and your team has, give yourself the time, especially the first time you're trying to go through this process with a primary prevention project, because it truly is using a new muscle. And, you can't go from doing, we are so used to doing response. We are so used to doing a specific exercise. And when you're trying to learn a whole new skill set, you really need to be kind to yourself and understand that time is really essential, and just allowing yourself that time. So I really appreciated that piece of advice, Hawa. That was one of my learnings, as you all know, is that we needed more time. So as a reminder, we have a few minutes left for the Q&A session. We went a little bit over, but thus far we have had no questions in the chat from participants. So if you do have any questions for our panelists or for Chiara, please feel free to drop it in the chat. But for now, I would like to ask Chiara, now that we have kind of gone through where we are right now with Prevention Initiative, if you could, if you could share with participants what other support or resources are available if they're looking to use the primary prevention framework.
Thanks, Michelle. So about the resources, like what is available is what we tried to present in the presentation, and everything is on the Alliance website in the Prevention Initiative web page. We had a few trainings in the past months. What we can provide now is some more tailored support through the virtual clinics, meaning either one-on-one coaching or a small group sessions for child protection practitioners who are going through different steps of their prevention program cycle. So we can organize focused workshops or like peer support groups with other organizations going through the same phase. Like at the moment we are working with some organizations either in organizing some awareness and capacity strengthening in their organizations or in designing a prevention program. So if this type of support is interesting to you, like just reach out by email to the Prevention Initiative, and I can drop the email address in the chat.
Thank you so much, Chiara. And we do have one question in the chat. Thank you, Colleen. So the question in the chat is how we will monitor and measure the activities with the ultimate goal of preventing harm. And this is an excellent question. As we mentioned, this is one of the key challenges, is really figuring out how best to measure harm averted. And so the approach that we're taking is to look at proxy indicators. So if our goal is to prevent child labor or child marriage through improving the protective factor of access to schools and decreasing the risk factor of lack of access to livelihoods, how do we then measure that, you know, the number of incidences of child marriage have decreased, or that the rate of child labor has decreased, especially keeping in mind that humanitarian programming runs on shorter cycles. So, you know, long term, you know, we would hope to see, in terms of, you know, larger data collection and monitoring around the incidence rates of child marriage and child labor, we would hope to see long term those reducing. But looking more specifically at these pilots, what we're thinking of is, so for example, in DIFA, we are specifically focusing on school retention. So what we will be measuring is the percent increase in retention in schools, as well as the increase in attendance in schools. And our thinking there is, if we know that being in school is a protective factor, and that children who are in school are less likely to be engaged in, to be married, and especially considering that age range that Paola mentioned, that, you know, girls who are, I believe it was like from 9 to 14 are more likely to be married. If we see that attendance in that age range increase, then we can assume that there is going to be a certain decrease in child marriage. And so it really is, this is the crux, and this is the most challenging part of primary prevention, is measuring that in the short term, and in the long term thinking about how do we then look at longer term results. Another approach that we can use is an outcome harvesting approach, which I am, as not an M&E expert, I'm not quite as prepared to speak to in depth. But the idea with an outcome harvesting approach is that you can use these proxy indicators to then determine the impact. And if I have misspoken on that front, I'm sure we have some M&E colleagues who can correct me. But with that, we have run out of time, and I would just like to, first of all, thank you so much to Chiara for your presentation. And thank you so much to Marian, Paola, and Hawa for sharing your thoughts and your learning so far. It has truly been really exciting to work with all of you on this initiative. And I'm just truly appreciative of all the hard work you have put into this so far. And it's great to kind of hear the learnings. And with that, I'm actually finishing on time. So thank you everyone for your participation, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the annual meeting.